This tutorial is aimed to support you in your understanding of the role of fiction in the module text and human experience. So we're looking at this focus question of why fictional stories are important. And here we go. I suppose what we're trying to do is help you develop some critical voice in the response that you give. So rather than just talking inside the text, you're actually talking about the bigger picture of how fiction and fictional stories are a lens into reality and our real worlds and our own personal experiences. So storytelling is something that's central to human existence, and throughout the centuries, societies have been fascinated by fictional stories because of the morals that they impart. Myths, for example, provide opportunities for learning, and as we read or listen to them, we reflect on the god's experience and apply it to our own. And in Greek mythology, Prometheus was a titan. He deceived the gods and he stole fire from them, which he then gave to humanity. And this allowed humans to progress and to develop civilized ways of thinking. So his generosity was sanctioned by the gods, and Prometheus, he was challenged and by them, and he was chained to a rock for all eternity. So his sacrifice challenged the powers of the gods and sets an example of acting for just causes despite the consequences. So the notion of standing up to a threatening power has been recycled and retold many times over. And it's relevant today as it was to the ancient Greeks. And the story tells us that in times of hardship or in times of oppression, we must be courageous and stand up for what we believe in. So morality, justice, ethics and honour are important concepts that we must consider in our world. And stories allow us to transcend time. And if you think about somewhere you've been that's really old, you know, it's sort of really mind-blowing to consider that people have been there before you and, you know, in some places, you know, centuries before. So, and a good example is when I went to Rome and walked around the streets of the Colosseum and the Forum. It was really incomprehensible for me to imagine that I was walking on the same path as Julius Caesar had once walked, and that the stone buildings that he experienced were still standing. And you know, another sort of divergence is the novel All the Light We Cannot See, which is in the advanced course. And what it does is it explores this idea of, you know, history and connection and stories. It explores this idea through the motif of diamonds. It considers that diamonds grow very slowly over long periods of time, you know, between 1 to 3 billion years apparently, and you know, microscopic layers of carbon are gradually added to the exterior of the stone. And the novel suggests that stories are the same. They develop layer after layer and they're passed along the generations. Now here's a little extract. Oh, we've got the layers. Here's a little extract from page 52 of All the Light We Cannot See. And it says, you know how diamonds, how all crystals grow, Lorette, by adding microscopic layers, a few thousand atoms every month, each atop the next, millennia after millennia. That's how stories accumulate too. All the old stones accumulate stories. That little rock you're so curious about may have seen Alaric sack Rome. It may have glittered in the eyes of the pharaohs. Scythian queens might have danced all night wearing it. Wars might have been fought over it. I think this is just a really interesting idea that we can look at, that you know, stories are passed on generation from generation through the span of our world history, and each time something is added to it and it's reshaped, and this is a really rich concept to look at. On a slight tangent, it's also interesting to consider that coal is made of carbon as well. So what is it that makes most carbon turn into coal, while some is lucky enough to turn into a diamond? And I'm sure there's a perfectly rational scientific explanation, But when we apply this to storytelling, there are some stories that stand out. They sparkle, they remain strong through eternity, and we must consider why. So if you listen to the podcast with Elliot Perlman, I think his name was, he stated that not all stories have a moral lesson, but the ones that do have a social message, and they're really valuable. And when we consider Past the Shallows, it's apparent that this is not an original story, and the story of survival is not a new one. So there must be some merit in the way that Parrot tells her tale that makes it worth reading. For me, there are a number of reasons why this story should be heard, but one of the main reasons is because it's told through the innocent eyes of Miles and Harry. And particularly for Miles, we see a progressive development from uncertainty to understanding. And it's like when murky water settles and then all you can do is see clearly. And this Baldwin's Roman device, or the story of the growing up, um, and this is by the novel's end, Miles is more aware of his circumstances that leads to Harry's death. And for me, it's heartbreaking to see Miles try and protect his brother from his father's unpredictability, all the while that he's as vulnerable as Harry. And so the tragedy of Harry's death hangs over the novel, but I really feel for Miles, who must come to terms with it all. And there are many what ifs as well in the novel. So, what if Joe was with them, on that day, and what if George was home the night before? Would the outcome be different? And regardless of this, though, the fact that Miles and Joe are moving on presents hope for the future, and you know that things will be okay for them. Now, as I mentioned earlier, stories of survival are not new, and what this story does is it presents a commentary on the story of Australia, the Australian narrative. And time is used in the novel to show how the individual experience of the boys is reflective of the collective Australian identity. Australians for the past 50,000 years have struggled to survive in the harsh Australian landscape. And the reference to the Aboriginal midden at the beach provides a temporal connection to the community. Um, yeah, and to communities long ago, and they're having a similar experience to Miles and Harry. The midden, however, presents a stronger sense of community, um, and this is evidenced in the the start of the novel when Harry is at the fair with Auntie Jean. You've got that connection and that happiness, and that draws, I think, on that. So we see aspects of that. In Miles's world, it's very isolated and detached. Now, the other aspect that looms over the novel is our knowledge that Tasmania was once a convict settlement, and it was as harsh and austere as it comes. Um, the convicts struggled to survive at the end of the world. And, Past the Shallows then suggests that it's time for us to move on. The Miles is moving on, and so should we as Australians. It defined us once, but it's no longer relevant. So we've got to break free of the shackles of our convict past and really embrace some modern Australia. I think there is a discourse, a commentary about Australia and who we are as a collective in this novel. Now, there's a long tradition of commenting on Australian identity in fiction, and I think Past the Shallows certainly does this well. So, why are fictional stories important? Just to conclude, and what they do is that they allow us to reflect on ourselves, both individually and as a nation or collectively. They allow us to reflect this way in the abstract world. Okay, so stories challenge us to think, to question our morals, what we value, and how we feel about who we are, and they resonate with us long after the story has been finished, how long it's concluded, and and we accumulate these stories. And so they are like the layers of the diamond that shape our thoughts, our opinions, and our sense of who we are. And finally, I think that I, I want you to think about a film or a novel that you've seen or read lately and ask yourself, what was it that made you enjoy it? And how did you identify with the central character? And what did you think about the story later and the characters and what happened in the story? That's really what is significant about storytelling. So perhaps much of your learning is unconscious, and perhaps these stories help shape your identity and your value system without you even knowing it. But now you do know it. So it's time for you to get out there and start thinking and applying what we've been talking about to your studies of this course.